My name is Michelle Stevens. I am an associate professor of Latin American history at West Virginia University, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Terry Rugeley, author of the new book, Antón Pérez, a novel of race, war, and passion. And I'll start by giving a few of my thoughts on the book, and then I will turn it over to Professor Rugeley to continue. I will first start by saying that the introductory essay manages to capture the chaos and calamity of the immediate post-independence period in a clear and concise way. And so I think that for students studying Mexican history, the introduction is thorough enough to provide some context for the novel and for the period. At the same time, there's enough juicy details to draw interested students to an era of Mexican history that is labyrinthine in its complications. As a historian of 19th and 20th century, and as someone who began her career studying a small region within the larger landscape of Mexico, I found Manuel Sánchez Mármol's novel to be compelling for a number of reasons that I will explore in these brief comments. Antón Pérez takes us out of the center of Mexico into its periphery, and Tabasco is seriously the periphery. Though not terribly distant from Mexico City if one looks at a map, there is a starkness in the distinction between the more metropolitan center of the country and the barely navigable province in which Sánchez Mármol was born, and where Antón Pérez took place. Through Pérez's eyes, readers can understand the distant and distinct nature of his homeland, the thick jungles, the barely tolerable heat, and the crashing storms. And so this begs the larger question of how the story of Mexico changes when pivotal events affecting the nation are investigated from the vantage point of outsiders and of average folks, as opposed to the political forces in the capital. Despite the fact that this novel is one of historical fiction and not of the exact events as they occurred in the 1860s, or of the life of Sánchez Mármol himself, there is merit in using this story to understand better the complexities of the French intervention period from the perspective of provincials. It is tempting to view Antón Pérez as a slightly fictionalized version of Mármol's life during this period, but Professor Rugeley is careful to point out in the introduction that this is not necessarily the case. For one thing, the namesake of the book, Antón Pérez, was of mixed ancestry and of generally humble origins. On the other hand, Mármol was a Creole. Perhaps Mármol's attitudes towards the general masses in Tabasco was mirrored in his portrayal of Rosalba, the haughty elite object of Pérez's desires throughout the story. I wondered as I was reading the book if Sánchez Mármol used Rosalba as a mirror of his own views at a certain point in his life, and I think that's something that we might be able to explore. Regardless of the veracity of the events as they unfolded in the novel, there are important considerations that readers should take away from this deeply engrossing and sometimes horrifying story. For instance, very early in the novel, we meet a young Pérez who desperately wanted to study, but sees no real means to do so. Aside from the exceptional, it was difficult to move up in society at this point in Mexico. Pérez is an example of that exception to a certain degree. Through him, we see that there is still a hangover from the colonial era, as post-independent society is still plagued by conceptions of honor and caste. In this way, there is a sort of timeless nature to this novel. These issues are in many ways still present in 21st century Mexican society. One need only to read about the treatment of the Oaxacan indigenous actress Yalitza Aparicio by online malcontents, or peruse the covers of fashion and society magazines that emphasize beautiful Mexican women who are distinctly whiter in appearance. And through academics initially and later in an almost fatalistic bravery in his military service, Antón Pérez attempts to improve his station in life, if seemingly for no other reason than to win the affections of a woman who clearly viewed herself as above him, and said so on a number of occasions. So deep was Pérez's obsession with Rosalba that he effectively sold out his own honor for the fleeting hope that she might return his affections. And even then, social distance separated the two in an echo of the colonial past. Antón Pérez also illustrates the complexities of the mid-century and post-liberal reforms in general, whether from the perspective of the center or the periphery. Chaos was a word that came to mind as I read the novel. Following a brief period in the 1840s when Mexicans seemed to unite in the face of the US invasion, that was simply not enough to hold the political fabric of the country together. Animosity between liberal and conservatives exploded, resulting in yet another invasion, this time one that occurred at the behest of disaffected conservatives. And here we see conflicting views on foreign interference that run throughout the novel. French imperialism was welcomed by some Mexicans, while the hated Yankee imperialism was palpable throughout the book. A last point that I want to make involves the issues of gender that lurk under the surface of the entire novel. Haughty, conniving, deviant. These words came to mind when thinking about Rosalba and her aunt, Doña Socorro. Rosalba was ever aware of the distance between herself and Pérez, and at times seemed to relish in tormenting him. Her aunt viewed Pérez as an object that could fulfill her own sexual desires, all the while well aware of Pérez's love for her niece. She used that love to coerce Pérez for her own political aims, that is, the victory of the conservatives over the liberal compatriots. And so this begs the question, how did Sánchez Mármol view gender relations in his own lifetime, particularly considering that a nascent feminism emerged in the last quarter of the 19th century, immediately prior to the publication of this book? Rosalba and Socorro were deviant. The soldadera La Amazoc broke traditional gender roles as well by becoming involved in the affairs of men. Compare this to Sánchez Mármol's characterization of the good-natured aunts of Pérez. Here, traditional gender roles emerged in the description of Tías Toribia and Anselma. And so just a last quick thing that I wanted to bring up. I think this novel could serve as an excellent teaching tool for historians. I have often used novels to illustrate particular points in Latin American history, especially Roberto Bolaño's Distant Star about Chile, and closer to home, Mariano Azuela's Los de Abajo. But in looking for a novel that sheds light on the tumultuous 1860s, I came up empty. And so I think this novel is excellent for undergraduates, since there's not really anything else accessible to them in English covering this period, and it's got all of the things that undergraduates like to read about. There's sex, there's drama, there's military invasion. And now I will turn it over to Professor Rugeley for comment.
Well, thank you so much to Michelle Stevens for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it, and thanks particularly to Cambria Press for the great faith that showed in this project, and I'm really delighted with the way that they've handled this and carried it out and made such a beautiful volume. Let me just say a few things about how this book began. Back around 2013, I was in the final stages of preparing a book on the history of Tabasco, which is called The River People in Flood Time, the Civil Wars in Tabasco, spoiler of empires. And it's a place where any paper that did not get out before 1900 was destroyed. And so I had to be very determined and resourceful and find sources, almost all of them outside of the state. I was surprised to learn that a Tabascan author named Antón Sánchez Mármol, a great man of letters of the state, had actually written a novel about his experiences. And it's particularly important, I thought, to capture this, because he had been, the young literati, secretary, understudy of the military officer who actually did the fighting in expelling the French. And I thought, oh gosh, this guy's, got to have something important to say that I can incorporate in the novel. The problem is what you always run into. He wrote this 40 years after the event. This is, a man looking back. And you don't know what's true or not. You don't know what's reliable history. Was it history the way that he wanted it to be, the way that a third party would have seen it? I just couldn't say. And so I avoided leaning on his narrative in actually that book. But I decided it's an important enough work that it really did require its own treatment. And so I set it aside and plugged away at a translation of it, which has come out, and again, I'm so grateful to Cambria for their support on this. I think there were a couple of important threads that define the book, and the first one is the social and political. This novel takes place in the crunch year of 1863 and 64. The French troops have arrived. They're there to impose a French empire under a figurehead named Maximilian. Maximilian doesn't actually arrive until 1865, I think. What's unusual about Tabasco is that it managed to expel the French, and it remained free Mexican territory during almost the entirety of the 4 or 5 year period of the empire, and doesn't, I think, get the credit it deserves for having done that. And this novel at least gives us one man's memory of those events. And I think even if everything that he writes about did not happen in the literal fashion, a lot of the themes and the conceptions, and in some cases the documentable personalities, yes, they are there, they are true. The second thing that this novel turns on is, as Michelle pointed out, is romantic and race relations. in a society in which these intimately depend on things like skin color, level of income, family connections. And Antón Pérez is defined as a pardo, and that used to mean very specifically a marriage of Indian and African peoples. By the 19th century, that term had lost a lot of its cogency, and it simply came to mean anybody that had some discernible African roots. And he's in love with the town beauty who is stereotypically of blonde hair and clear eyes, and anybody who's spent any time in Mexico still knows that these are commodities of great purchase. And he buys into this very heavily and has no eyes for any woman but her. Of course, has no use for the guy. And these are the struggles. Now, the book itself, I think, is fascinating for a number of reasons. And one of the things is Sánchez Mármol himself. He's a Porfirian literati. He is a positivist. He is a man who expresses 19th century liberal ideals, secularism, secular society and state, assuming a lot of the responsibilities of education and training and management that had previously been occupied by the Catholic Church. What struck me as truly amazing about this book is he's not doctrinaire at all. The man looks back at the past with profoundly mixed emotions. His sections on what he remembers of religious festivals, for example, during the days immediately before the liberal reform, these drip with nostalgia. And this could be old man's disease, as they say. Nostalgia kills more people than heart disease. This could be what's driving a lot of the novel. I think a great deal of it is a man reflecting back and using his literary skills, to capture that elusive realm that is the past. And he does a really fantastic job with it. He tells us about a part of Mexico that a lot of us don't really know. It's a part of the southeast, but even the southeast, it's not very well known. I think it's fascinating from a historical point of view because it does get us into a part of Mexican history that most Mexican historians don't really know much about, and that is the fact that Tabasco managed to liberate itself before the whole thing ever began. And if he does not report accurately the words of those individuals, well, I think that he probably does capture their spirit. I think the novel is also fascinating from the point of view of its main character, Antón Pérez. He's really an engaging guy in a lot of ways. You kind of feel sorry for this poor fellow. He wants to believe so desperately in something. First, he wants to believe that this woman loves him. Maybe there's a shot, and of course there is such a shot. He wants to win the respect of his fellow townsmen by becoming a leader in the resistance. And he very quickly realizes they don't pay any attention to him, and he actually ends up working for a short period for the empire. I think he's also fascinating as a tragic hero. He doesn't quite do the things you want a tragic hero to do. You expect, you lose something, you're defeated, like Oedipus Rex, but you gain some kind of knowledge. And one of the things about poor old Antón Pérez is just, like they say of the Habsburg, he learned nothing and forgot nothing. He never seems to get beyond this fantasy of hooking it up with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed gal, and it's just not going to happen. And he goes to the very, very end of the novel struggling with it. Now, that's not to say it's a flawed novel. I think that's what really drew Sánchez Mármol to the theme. The fact that we don't seem to get out of this maze, that we don't seem to be able to break these barriers of class and race that define our society. And I think it's very telling that he finally published this book. He's only like 2 years out from the time that he dies. He apparently spent his entire life struggling with these issues and trying to come to some kind of an understanding. And I think if the only understanding you come to is the permanence of those limitations, well, all right, that's at least something. So I think the novel really has so much to go for it. There are three particular audiences to whom I would recommend this work. The first is just, as Michelle points out, to historians. I think anybody who is looking for some kind of accessible text to get into a period that is very confusing, tends to be written off in the history books as a kind of comic opera. This gets us at the human level. This gets us to how people in little bitty villages experience the great wave of national events. The second audience I'd like to recommend this to are those brave literary scholars who are ready to strike out against the wicked canonical texts. If you're looking for something that's anti-canonical, believe me, you have found it in this. I think even in Mexico, this is going to be a rediscovery. So I'm hoping this takes us into a realm of literary knowledge that many of us just simply have not had the opportunity to explore. And then, third and last comment, I want to remind everybody that Christmas is not as far away as it seems. And if you happen to have a friend or relative who you think could use an improving moral lesson, I'm just saying, this book might be the perfect opportunity to set things on a positive course. Again, thanks to everybody. I hope anybody who reads this book gets the enjoyment out of it that I did. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.